The invitation to come speak this morning. As I was writing the sermon, it occurred to me that since I'm not speaking to my own church, I can be inflammatory and actually stay on the membership rolls. I'm kidding, but only kind of. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with To Kill a Mockingbird, the 1960 novel, 1962 film that was based on it. It's a classic cultural production of the civil rights era. And it has a clear message about the social basis of racism. The setting is a small southern town, and the protagonist is the widowed lawyer Atticus Finch. When an African-American man, Tom Robinson, is falsely accused of attempted rape of a white woman, Finch defends him, defying white supremacy and appealing to the higher ground of truth and justice. Finch is shunned by local whites. And in the climactic trial scene, Bob Ewell and his daughter Mayella, the accusers, play on the emotions of white supremacy, swaying the all-white jury into a guilty verdict for Robinson, even as the viewer knows with Finch that he is definitely innocent. Clothing, speech, manners, and residence. These are all on dramatic display and essential to the message. Finch wears suits, talks with eloquence and precision, displays the manners of respectability, and lives in a spacious house on one of the town's prime residential streets. He is middle class. The Ewells, by contrast, wear clothes suited for manual labor, talk in a drawl, get drunk on moonshine, and live in a rough cabin in the countryside. They are poor. Indeed, in material conditions, the Ewells seem no different from Tom Robinson. Both Robinson and Bob Ewell wear the de facto uniform of Southern agricultural workers, overalls. But material similarities and differences don't matter much. It is a middle-class white man who defends a poor black man in the face of accusation from poor whites. This is the key message of the book and film. Racism in the South comes not from well-meaning middle-class whites, but from those people. Poor whites, people ridiculed by names like rednecks, hicks, hillbillies, or worst of all, white trash. The message is hardly limited to Kill a Mockingbird. To take a recent example, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and I like Elizabeth Warren, but still, and I'll come back around to that. Speaking at the 2016 Democratic National Convention, argued, quote, "Divide and conquer is an old story in America. Dr. Martin Luther King knew it. After his march from Selma to Montgomery, he spoke of how segregation was created to keep people divided. Instead of higher wages for workers, Dr. King described how poor whites in the South were fed Jim Crow, which told a poor white worker that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man better than a black man. Racial hatred was part of keeping the powerful on top," end of quote. And of course, on the heels of the election, and really before it too, a culture that doesn't talk much about class was all of a sudden talking a lot about it. The dominant analysis had a clear class explanation: working class whites. That's who had risen up and propelled Trump into the presidency in what Van Jones evocatively called a white lash. J.D. Vance's just published memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, was selling like hotcakes as people wanted to understand who exactly these people were and why they'd reacted so strongly against the hopeful promise of the Obama years. Let me leave these reflections on class and race and the intertwined ways in which they inform politics and power dynamics, pause for a bit. I'll come back around, but for a few moments, I want to engage in different reflections. Many years ago in grad school, as I was completing my coursework, I was trying to zoom in and focus on the next step, my dissertation topic. In a casual conversation, an idea struck me. What if I started with the fictional world of my favorite writer, Flannery O'Connor, and tried to find out if it had a real-world historical basis? O'Connor wrote jarring, violent, theologically obsessed stories about what she called a Christ-haunted South. Certainly she had a brilliant literary imagination, but was she making this up out of thin air? Or was she evoking something real, something that the historians I was reading had actually missed? I was at a graduate school known for its strength in Southern history, and my studies had impressed two things on me about the early to mid 20th century South. That severe poverty was widespread, that the South was a poor region in a prosperous country, and secondly, that white supremacy, the elaborate culture and mechanisms of Jim Crow, was the key structure of the social order. Where in this, I wondered, was O'Connor's theologically obsessed, Christ-haunted South? So I dove into source materials with a clear image in mind. Could I find O'Connor's world? It took time, confusion, karaoke sessions, promising leads that ended up as dead ends, and a transformed vision that learned to see apparently ephemeral things as actually vital sources, but I did find O'Connor's world in the actual past. I found it, and though this now seems self-evident, it took me years to actually realize and articulate it. I found it among the poor. And I deliberately mean that as a blanket term. I found it among poor whites and among poor blacks. There were major substantive differences, I came to see, between the Christianity of the middle class, embodied in first churches throughout the region, and the Christianity of the poor. In the religious life of the poor, I found haunting songs of personified death, mystical yet sensory tales of conversion, grassroots sacraments that tangibly express the sacred, and a countercultural ethic of neighborliness. The lives of the poor were filled with hardship, and yet in hardship, they crafted what one impoverished man evocatively called a hard religion. Here's a Kentucky coal miner talking about his religious life. This is a long quote. Sometimes over there in that little church of ours, I feel there's forgiveness in this world. And the good Lord, he's near us, and he isn't going to let us get completely taken over by the bad in the world and the bad that's in yourself and the bad that's in others. But like the Bible will tell you, it's a big struggle, and no matter if you're high or low, you're going to be fighting the struggle all your life. And a lot of the time, you'll be near to losing with the devil just about to claim you as property. But then you'll be singing a hymn or like that, and you'll turn around and realize you're in danger and get saved in the nick of time. Yes, sir, right in the nick. And here, hundreds of miles away, yet in the same idiom, is an Alabama sharecropper talking about her religious life. I'll wake up sometimes and I'll ask myself whether it's going to be today that something real bad will happen. Some days just go fast and nothing real bad happens, but all of a sudden we'll get lots of troubles come our way, and it makes you wonder if you can last. It's then that you stop and remind yourself the Lord is up there and he doesn't miss a single trick. I mean, how could he? I admit that every once in a while I catch myself getting worried. That's when I'll say to myself that maybe this is hell. Right here, right where we are. And it's not a good thought to have. It's a bad one, but sometimes you can't help yourself. These two statements come from people with lives of complex interiority. Poor people who differ sharply from the dismissive image of the Ewells in To Kill a Mockingbird. Both speakers voice a persistent struggle without any plateau of once and for all victory. And for both speakers, the struggle is not about some compensatory other world, but about seeing and practicing goodness, forgiveness in this world. Struggling to live fully in this world, that's very different from the most common view of the religion of the poor, that it is deeply otherworldly, a compensation for this worldly lack, the opiate of the masses. Let's listen to two more statements, excerpts from Conversion Tales. Here's a woman, a domestic worker in Central Tennessee. At 11 o'clock on Wednesday, God took me off. I experienced death the way I'm going to die. I was flying in the air. He throwed me down stiff. I was standing up ironing one morning, and I felt death creeping up on my toes, then to my knees, and finally I was waist deep in death. Then I lost my sight, and God throwed me on the bed. My fingers were like candlesticks. The next morning, everything was white. My hands were like snow. They just shined. They looked like the sun was on them. Then he led me into the green pastures. I've never heard such preaching in my life. And here is a male coal miner in the Virginia Blue Ridge. Long about 9 o'clock, I laid down across the bed, and being laying there, a man appeared over me. He was just as white as snow. And I felt myself getting numb down in my feet, and death crept on up. I was just sure I was dying. It passed on up to my eyes. My eyes, they felt like they was full of sand. I was about to close them. When the Lord brought me to, I was laying on a little bench, and I hear a voice, and it spoke like this: "Arise now and shine." When I come out, everything looked new. Everything was summertime, and the trees was green all around. I ain't never seen a morning so bright. Mystical, absolutely, yet also so sensory and tangible. The conversions are not about getting a ticket to go to heaven, but about being rescued from death to live anew in this very material world. What I've left out in framing these is racial identity. 2 of these speakers are African American, the second and third, and 2 are white, the first and fourth. How to make sense of this? What I ended up claiming in the book, based on evidence of which this is a glimpse, is that poor whites and poor blacks listened to each other, borrowed from each other, and learned from each other about what it meant to live as Christians in a world of severe material lack. The religious culture they crafted, hard religion, or to use my more technical term, folk Christianity, folk, as in folklore, was the fruit of interracial exchange. The book's subtitle broadcasts this: Interracial Faith in the Poor South. This was the early to mid-20th century South, the very era of Jim Crow. I am not arguing that the poor organized a collective challenge to white supremacy. They did not. Their folk Christianity was crafted within the structures of Jim Crow. But in the exchange and mutuality of folk Christianity, other identities than race, being poor, being Christian, became central. So what about the entrenched images and assumptions embodied so well in To Kill a Mockingbird? That poor whites are the stronghold of racism. First, I'd say to not just writers, but historians too, the intense racism of poor whites has been much more asserted than proven. And that's not to say that it didn't and doesn't exist. But historians want solid evidence for any claim that is made. You can't just assert something based on, well, we know how those people are. I've given you evidence, glimpses for my crazy claim of interracial exchange. I want to see evidence for the very familiar claim of poor whites' racism. Second, locating racism among those people has great emotional utility. And that's understandable, but also highly problematic. Middle-class whites like Atticus Finch, they're the good guys, well-meaning believers in equality under the law. But those people pull society down. The consoling message of this is way too easy. That the basic structures of the society are okay. By placing racism among those people on social margins, we're denying that racism is deeply woven into the fabric of our society. It is centuries in the making and remaking, and it's at the core of our social order. We need to see it for the central phenomenon that it is, rather than imaginatively move it to impoverish people on the margins. But wait, a little voice is asking, wasn't it the white working class who propelled Trump into the presidency? Didn't we see them in Trump rallies? Don't you see the most visible emblems of white supremacy, Confederate flags, outside the homes of impoverished white people? On the election, I would say that we can readily omit the class status, that adjective, working class whites. It was simply whites who elected Trump. As Van Jones noted, it was a white lash, not a working class white lash, but a white lash. And yes, the racism of some working class whites is certainly visible. But I'd quickly add that middle class and elite whites have much less visible, more covert, more respectable ways of embodying their racism. It's harder to see on full display, but it's certainly there in talk of good neighborhoods, good schools, crime, who works hard, etc. Let's step back to the Jim Crow era for just a moment. Whites of all classes participated in the culture of Jim Crow. It was not the unique preserve of poor whites. And if we think back closely to what Elizabeth Warren said, echoing Dr. King, the creators of Jim Crow were not the poor. Indeed, both Dr. King and Warren argued that Jim Crow was a technique to divide poor whites and poor blacks, that it sought to stifle any chance of an interracial challenge from the poor against the propertied. But some poor whites, and it's very difficult to estimate the numbers, participated in religious exchange with some poor blacks. Again, very difficult to estimate the numbers. Together, they participated in a different culture than that of Jim Crow. And it's important to emphasize that it wasn't the middle class or elite who did this, but the poor. Bringing it back to the present, the pertinence of the history lesson is that if we know that something existed in the past, we're more likely to see, or at least be looking for, instances of it in the present. In Richmond County in 2018, 1 out of 4 people live below the poverty line. 30% of African Americans and 17% of whites are living in severe poverty. In my first days in Augusta, I was struck by just how visible and intense the poverty was. I often brood on what I, as a comfortably middle-class white person, can do. And I confess that I can't answer my own brooding with any definite answers. But I've also been struck by what I see in the impoverished neighborhood that I live close to, Harrisburg. It was created in the late 19th, early 20th century for white textile workers, but today Harrisburg is the most visibly integrated neighborhood in Augusta. Whites and blacks live in close proximity, they hang out together, and interracial couples are easy to see. For me, there's hope in that, amidst intense poverty. Like the source material I encountered in what became my book, it makes me question my own class-based assumptions about where intense racism is to be found. And as I try and discern my own social responsibility as a person of privilege, it sends a message that is the opposite of To Kill a Mockingbird. I need to engage with poverty and racism, not in comforting accusation that it's poor whites who are racist and therefore not my problem, but rather in what I call penitential implication. I participate in a society that's been structured by and for the benefit of people like me. Last summer in a small town in Mississippi, I was struck by the statement of an older African-American man, a veteran of the civil rights movement. He said that, quote, "Those who created the problem have a responsibility to help solve the problem." I'd felt that at some level, but never actually been able to articulate it. To me, he captured succinctly my own social responsibility. I've been using I a lot in this latter part because I think that penitential implication must necessarily begin with I. But of course, it doesn't stop there. It necessarily pushes us out to think about our social responsibility. As I confessed earlier, I don't know exactly what to do about the deep issues of poverty and racism in the local community. But I do know this: pawning the problems off on those people won't get us anywhere. Amen.